Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure meeting you. My name is Fernando Reimers, and I'm a professor of comparative and international education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I'm here joined by my colleagues, the teaching fellows who have taught with me a course on comparative education policy last fall, and by some of my former students whose work we're celebrating today. Um, in this course, as I'm going to explain in a moment, students produce knowledge that actually helps solve real problems, complex problems in the real world. And then the best of those projects are invited to become chapters in this book, which has just been published and which is now, from what I see, a bestseller in some categories on Amazon list. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to briefly set the stage for our webinar, and then invite my colleagues who are here to introduce themselves and to make a few contributions. And then at the end of the hour, we're going to have a little bit of time for you to pose your questions, which you can do using the Q&A function. So this book that we're celebrating today, Leading Education Systems, Learning from Policy Challenges and Practices Around the World, contains the work of students in the first cohort of the online education policy and management strand of the online education leadership program at the School of Education. It's a new program and it's a very new strand. This is the first cohort of students in the program. This is a program that was designed to invite, as members of our community, experienced practitioners, people who in very different positions are leading educational change. It's a very diverse cohort that brings people from 30 different countries, over 70 students from different countries who are all working full time while doing part time this master's program over 2 years. And they all took this class together last fall. This is a class that is designed as an introduction to the field of comparative education policy. The way this class works is it invites students to form teams or to work individually for a client, that has a vexing education challenge on which they will need a little help. Each one of them is going to tell you who their client was and what was the vexing challenge that they were facing. And then they spend a semester as they learn the tools, the techniques of education policy analyses, helping that apply those techniques to helping that client solve the problem. And they conclude with a recommendation. So in many ways, I use the metaphor in this class that this is a course about learning to ride the bicycle of doing education policy analysis while riding the bicycle. For some students, it'll be a bit daunting to be invited as they're beginning to engage in this class to apply techniques they haven't yet mastered on issues of real consequence, on issues that really matter to people. But I think that kind of challenge, I mean, we all grow as leaders by putting ourselves in positions that are a little bit above our head, that challenge us, because that's how we grow. And I think all of the students whose work is reflected in this book grew tremendously. They all learn not only to ride the bicycles, but to do turns on the bicycles, to be on one wheel in the bicycle. They really have mastered the art of policy analysis. And you're going to see some of that today. I think the book is also an example of how it is possible in universities to intertwine the three core functions of the university. Number one, the educational function. We live at a time where it's very important to help our students develop a range of skills that have to do with solving problems creatively, innovatively, with others, to help students develop the skills to face new problems that they haven't encountered before. And in a way, this course is an immersive experience in that kind of education. But the second function of the university, of course, is to generate knowledge. And this book turns what is essentially pedagogical content, the product of the learning experiences of the students, into public knowledge and subjects those creations of these students to public scrutiny, as is the norm in academic communities. And so this book embodies the possibility of melding the education and the knowledge generation function of the universities. The third strand of the university mission that this book represents is our commitment to improving the communities of which we are a part, the extension function of the university, the social impact function of the university, and in mobilizing the talent of this very talented group of students to help expand the capacity of people who are solving problems and who welcome that extra little bit of help of talented people who can devote a semester of their talent, of their good thinking to solve a problem. We show that we can integrate those three things. One last thing I will say before I turn it over to my colleagues is that one of the skills that we try to develop in this course is what I will call a comparative mindset, the capacity to draw from the world as a rich laboratory of ideas, of innovations. And that comparative mindset is, of course, developed by a set of readings and a set of exercises that the course presents and engages students with. But it is also developed in community, in a global community. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is a very internationally diverse community of more than 70 people from 30 different countries. But simply bringing a diverse group of people together doesn't mean that that becomes a learning opportunity. In order for that to become a learning opportunity, we have to engage our students in opportunities for co-creation, for collaboration, for discussion with one another, in opportunities to be challenged by each other so that we expand the way in which we think about ourselves, about others, about the world in which we're trying to make a difference. And that is what the course has tried to do. Um, I'm currently working on a paper precisely, which I'm going to present at the next conference of the Comparative and International Education Society, of how experiences like the one that we're discussing today helps develop, helps cultivate a comparative mindset in education. I will just say one thing. In this course, as is the case with every course at Harvard, we conclude the course asking students to fill out evaluations. And this year, at my suggestion, a number of courses at the Ed School included the question, what have you learned from interacting, from taking this class with a group of peers from different countries? And the students in this class, and in a similar version of this class that I teach in our residential program, gave the course very high marks on that issue. They all said that uh, they learn from being in an internationally diverse community. So with that by way of introduction, welcome to all of you. I'm not going to myself introduce my colleagues because I think they'll do a much better job than I will, and because I am out of time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zainab Azim, one of the splendid teaching fellows in this class, who's going to talk about the use of one methodology in this course, project-based learning. Over to you, Zainab.
Thank you, Fernando. It's nice to see everyone again. Yes, I was a teaching fellow for this course, the first time that we did this course on the online master's program, and it was a delight to learn with all the students there and work with them. And one of the ways in which we did that was through the project-based learning pedagogy. And so in BA 801, the culminating task isn't just a theoretical paper, it is a policy analysis that is done for a real client, be that a ministry official, a program director, a school network leader, someone who's actually responsible for the problem students or their constituency is facing. And that's the core of project-based learning in our professional policy program, is that you are working on an authentic problem with incomplete or contested evidence, and your recommendation has to be useful to someone who is going to decide what to do with it next. And so how that affects how students are learning is three main things that stood out for us in this cohort. First is that the problem definition becomes a little trickier when you're dealing with a real client. You can't just pick a framing that's most convenient or that you find on a Google search. You really have to understand deeply and negotiate what the problem actually is, and starting from that instead of a solution, a predefined solution, who it really affects and what's within the client's reach to change. Second, we saw students having to make judgments under constraints, right? The best option on paper might not be affordable or politically feasible, or operationally your client may not be able to implement. So you're learning to understand trade-offs. You're understanding, although you might not be implementing when the rubber hits the road, you are thinking about that for your client because they will hopefully be using it in a real life situation. And third, learning how to communicate, not just communicating to an academic audience, although Fernando just said one of the jobs of this institution is to produce knowledge. We also want to make sure people can use that knowledge, right? Knowledge is only information. It becomes power when you can use it. And so being able to communicate with their clients, with decision makers in the language that they can act on is a skill that we hope we honed through this pedagogy. And that said, also being honest that there are limitations to this type of pedagogy. In a semester long course, it can limit how deeply we are able to go from analysis to actual adoption. The research on project-based learning and policy programs is clear that there is limited evidence of direct policy uptake from projects due to the timeline. But what project-based learning does allow us to do is build the judgment and the relational skills and the communication skills and these really authentic capacities in students to make them more effective when they return to their own systems and the clients that they will continue to work with. And so I want to come then to a real life example of that with a student project that Jason is going to be presenting on learning continuity in the Philippines amid climate disruption, a case where the elements of that of PBL are very clear: real client, messy evidence, political and logistical constraints, and the need to understand how the rubber hits the road and how that changes your analysis. So Jason, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Good morning, everyone. This spotlight, I'll share our insights from Chapter 3, which examines learning continuity in the Philippines and climate disruptions. Rather than retelling the whole chapter, I'll highlight how this work illustrates the broader principles introduced in the book: adaptability, inclusion, and systems thinking. So for the chapter context, the chapter looks at how schools in climate vulnerable regions responds when disruptions threaten education. Is a case study of resilience in the face of uncertainty, showing both the creativity of local communities and the structural gaps that make continuity difficult. This reflects the book's introduction, especially in education system, how it must be designed to adapt, not just endure. And the key finding in the root cause that we saw in this was that the fragmented condition between local schools and national policy frameworks, this root cause meant that even strong local initiatives struggled to scale or sustain impact. It illustrated the principle that resilience requires integration, systems thinking that connects local realities with national strategies. So when we were working with EdCom 2 and going through the motion of how we were going to do the policy recommendation, from this, we were able to engage them on two policy recommendations. First, to strengthen local national coordination through adaptive governance mechanisms. Second, invest in flexible learning modalities from modular, digital, and even community-based approaches like the dynamic learning program that would allow continuity even during crisis. These recommendations, as we work with them, embody the introduction's call for equity-driven, inclusive policies that refuse to defer the things that can be overlooked. So the connection to project-based learning, the work also connected directly on this, and the client engagement meant for us grounding the study in the lived experiences, especially for me working in these levels and going through the motions, and even myself throughout the class, I was losing internet connectivity, and I have to attend classes even right after a storm or even when I was responding. And because of that, we were able to engage the education stakeholders and do an iterative scoping that allowed us to research to adapt to the new disruptions as it unfolded. Translating evidence into feasible sequencing identified actionable steps. And personally, my learning has shifted because of the class and how we engage the client from abstract resilience theory to practical sequencing of adaptive solutions. So, in closing, for us, chapter 3 wasn't just about the Philippines. It's about how local case studies illuminate global principles. And it shows that adaptive inclusions and system thinking are not abstract ideas, and they are lived necessities. This spotlight demonstrates how the book's introduction comes alive in practice, and it reminded us that resilience education is both systemic and deeply human. Therefore, I really want to thank my co-authors in this, Mariah Lynn, Bisola Alabi, and Nia Page, for us to be able to go through the process and be able to engage our stakeholders and our client effectively in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. We're now going to hear from Jolene Chia, another teaching fellow in the course, who's going to talk about the comparative perspective that we teach in this course.
Thank you, Professor Reimers. And hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, and congratulations to all of our co-authors and co-editors for making this a success and making this project happen. So in these chapters and in this research that everyone conducted, we focused on comparative research, and all of the authors conducted at least 2 rounds of rigorous literature review to not only learn about the root causes and the context of where their research was based, but also to learn from other comparable contexts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what discipline comparison looks like. And it begins with meaningful comparators, and it's also known as the basis for comparison that we heard and thought a lot about as we went through the research process. And basically, this is about not just looking for research in like any context, but looking for research in comparable contexts, whether it's in terms of system-wise, whether it's in terms of the the regional aspects, or whether it's in terms of like size, or just yeah, whether there was a clear rationale for looking at these different contexts and trying to see what we can learn from these. Another key point is about mechanisms, not mimicry, that is actually just focused on not just trying to mimic what is currently existing in other contexts, but learning from what actually could drive outcomes and what could actually be feasible, a feasible adaptation to our context. Another key thought that we looked very deeply at was adaptation versus borrowing, which is basically about how policies must be reshaped to fit local institutions, cultures, and constraints. And in practice, as we all came to realize, is that successful systems are almost always adapted and not copied wholesale. And the 3 aspects, as you begin to read through the different chapters, would be that a lot of research was conducted, and a lot of analysis was conducted on the contextual aspects and also the different types of feasibility, whether it was political feasibility, um, or other types of capacity constraints. And we also kept in mind to avoid selection bias in the process of conducting these. So instead of asking, how do we replicate this policy from another country, a more disciplined question that a lot of us asked was, what conditions made this policy successful in X, Y, or Z context that we are trying to look for, learn from, and also whether the same conditions exist in our context of research focus. And unfortunately, this is not always, research is not always used in such a careful way, and comparative evidence is not always used in such a careful way. It often plays a different role, one of agenda setting or legitimization. And a lot of times, policymakers and advocates may point to high-performing systems or international rankings just to justify reforms that they already support. So in these cases, comparison becomes less about learning and more about persuasion. But this is also not inherently negative, and it just means that we need to approach comparative claims more critically. So the key things that I mentioned earlier on: context, implementation capacity, and selection bias. These were things that we looked deeply at that I hope everyone will also keep in mind as you begin to learn from these different chapters. And in conclusion, comparative research is a powerful tool, but only when used with discipline. And it requires us to move beyond surface similarities to instead focus on the mechanisms and to remain attentive to context and capacity. So with this, I'm going to introduce Alina Grigor, who will be sharing about Chapter 5, Foundational Literacy Gaps in Romania, that was co-authored by Alina, who will be speaking, as well as Christine Wadey. And over to you, Alina.
Thank you, Jolene. Hello, everyone. I'm Alina Grigore from Romania. I'm a theater and film director and a learning facilitator for Inlight School. And together with my colleague Christine Savoit, she's the head of Educate Me Foundation in Egypt, we worked on this chapter examining foundational literacy and numeracy gaps in Romania and what comparative evidence suggests for a policy action. Thank you, Professor Reimers, for this opportunity. Thank you, teaching team, for editing and helping us so much. And thank you all for participating. In Romania, nearly 1 in 2 primary school children does not reach foundational literacy benchmarks. Around 1/4 also fail to reach basic numeracy standards, and these gaps are much deeper in rural schools, for example, in disadvantaged communities and among Roma children. And what makes this especially important is that these early deficits do not disappear, they reappear later in adolescence, including in national and international assessments such as PISA. While working on this process of finding a valuable option for Teach for Romania to support FLN, we realized soon enough, just as Joylene said, that comparative evidence will help us not by identifying a model to copy, but by clarifying the mechanisms. So teaching at the right level, for example, showed us that students that were farthest behind improve when instruction is organized by learning level rather than age. Kenya's TUSAM demonstrated that coaching and formative assessment can work at a national scale when they're embedded in government routines. And NGO government hybrid models added another lesson that intensity and scale often require different actors working together. So Christine and I understood fast enough that Romania cannot simply just import these models because our context included fragmented implementation, uneven inspectorate capacity, weak use of assessment data in classroom, and in Romania, for example, heavy dependence on short-term project funding. So that meant that comparative research had to be translated into something that was also institutionally realistic, because after Teach for Romania, the Ministry of Education kind of became our second client. So we had to translate everything, not just borrow as a ready-made solution. So this is why our recommendation became a bundle national-local strategy. Nationally, the Ministry of Education right now anchors standards, diagnostics, and remediation through instruments already in place, such as MIAF, BRIO, and ROFUIP. But at the same time, organizations such as Teach for Romania could provide high-intensity implementation in districts where needs are greatest. So our broader lesson was that comparative evidence is most useful when it helps design feasible combinations rather than search for, let's say, one best solution. So thank you all for participating. I would also like to thank again Professor Reimers, the teaching team, and of course Christine Safwat for being an awesome project partner. And I would be happy to take any questions during the Q&A. And I want to thank again Teach for Romania and the Ministry of Education, who were deeply involved in the process, and we learned how to gather evidence while communicating with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina. One of the things we do in this course is we try to form communities of practice, and our teaching fellow, Mohammed Beghi, is going to talk about that.
Thank you so much, Professor Reimers. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this book launch. My name is Mohammed Beghi, and I served as a teaching fellow for BA 801 in the fall, and I'm also really honored to be a member of the editing team for Leading Education Systems. My message today is very clear. This book is not just a collection of strong individual chapters, but it's a product of a global community of practice. In this global community of practice, we had 3 layers. The first one was project teams working with real clients, constantly testing each other's problem statements, data, and recommendations. The second one was the cohort as a whole, the IEPM cohort, which was 70 people strong, using shared tools from root cause analysis to Bardak's Eightfold Path to theories of change and comparative frameworks, so we could have a common analytic language that we all understood. And the third one was a shared boundary with real systems in the world, from nonprofit organizations to ministries and to school systems who were the intended readers of this work, not just us in the teaching team. And because this was an online program, the community had to be built very intentionally. And there are three pillars there that I will speak about. The first one was clear routines. We had weekly readings, pre-recorded lectures, section discussions, and structured feedback throughout. The second pillar, and the most important one in my opinion, was psychological safety. We had to make it very normal for students to say, I don't think my theory of change is there, or I'm not super sure about this idea, which is why I took sometimes even 20 minutes at the start of section, building that psychological safety through community building and making sure everybody is feeling safe. And the final one is seeing the visible progress that was being made with each draft in the papers that we're building on top of each other. That's why I'm proud to say that these chapters are not only analytically rigorous and solid, but intellectually solid, but it's actually very usable and ready to be implemented by decision makers. To see what this looks like in practice, let me hand over to Risto, whose chapter on immigrant background students in Finland shows how this kind of community can strengthen both diagnosis and feasibility in the real world. Risto, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I have a few slides prepared. So good morning, everyone. My name is Risto Ihalainen, and I'll speak today a bit about what we learned about immigrant background disparities in Finland with my team, Jojo Mäkichen, Jenny Yunhu Kim, and Pallas Gertorfason. I'll also speak a few words then in how working in these communities of practice shape that learning and also our identities as educators and analysts. So first, let me start with the problem. Finland performs above the OECD average on PISA, but the overall performance has been declining over the past 2 decades. Gaps between student groups have become very persistent, and especially for learners with an immigrant background. In PISA 2022, the first generation immigrant background students scored over 60 points lower than native-born peers in both reading and mathematics. And that's almost 2 years worth of learning, and it's one of the largest gaps in OECD. So when we looked at this, what we found behind it, it's not just a story of socioeconomic and poverty, it's also points to system conditions as a cause. And why does it matter so much? The number of non-native speakers in Finland has grown from almost zero from early 90s to roughly 600,000 people today. So it makes it one of the major challenges of the Finnish system. The gap undermines Finland's commitment to equity and fairness, and it weakens the credibility of the education model, which is built on equal opportunity, and it also erodes social cohesion and economic sustainability in a country that's aging and it's increasingly reliant on immigration. So 13% of students are of immigrant background. What we found is disparities tend to start early, intensify gradually, and then become visible in later outcomes. Early exposure to Finnish shapes school readiness. That readiness shapes participation in subject learning, and the language is the gateway to learning through text, interaction, and assessments. And over time, these small early differences then start compounding. We identified 3 reinforcing root causes along the pathway. First was uneven participation in early childhood education and care, which is especially important for children learning the language of schooling. The second was concentration and resourcing. Linguistic diversity and socioeconomic disadvantage are increasingly concentrated in large urban schools. And the third is declining reading engagement and widening literacy gaps. Only about a third of Finnish 15-year-olds read for enjoyment. And all these achievement gaps are also belonging gaps. Based on this, we developed 3 policy options and ultimately recommended an integrated strategy, which was increasing equitable participation in early childhood education through incentive reforms, strengthening national teacher learning pathway and multilingual pedagogy, and expanding schools to serve as community education hubs that would strengthen trust, navigation, and belonging for families and students. And rather than 3 isolated reforms, we propose to sequence them for holistic implementation. In conclusion, for us, success would be ensuring linguistic background no longer predicts opportunity, and Finland has the capacity for the changes. The challenge is to have a coherent approach. And for us, working on this as a community of practice was essential, and it was very enriching. Our clients pushed us really to sharpen our causal chain and to be explicit about the policy recommendations. We had interviews with teachers, municipalities, and national agencies, and we were able to stress test the feasibility of the options we were proposing, especially around the points that were politically sensitive. We kind of found ourselves acting as a connectors, trying to translate the evidence we had into narratives that those policymakers and practitioners could all work with. I think equally important was sharing and getting feedback from the cohort, and also sharing within our own team. We had a 4-person team that was really, really strong. And that team also made us much more attentive to voices we hadn't centered on enough during our work. In that sense, this project for us was not only about integrated strategy for Finland, but it was also about becoming a different kind of analyst and seeing that analysis as shared relational practice that was grounded in evidence. Thank you.
That was great, Risto. Thank you so much. I'm going to invite another member of the teaching team, Shifat, to give us an overview of the volume. Shifat, over to you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for this opportunity to be a part of this editing team of this book and to serve as a teaching fellow of this wonderful cohort of our first online EdM program at Harvard Graduate School of Education. So while the chapters in this volume span widely through different geographies, education levels, and policy arenas, the chapters are united by 7 cross-cutting themes, though in the book, those are organized thematically into 4 sections. But I will talk a little bit about all these 7 cross-cutting themes. First one comes equity as an organizing purpose. So equity is not treated as a side constraint or like an afterthought. In the central analytical lens of this volume, across all the chapters, policy alternatives are just not just by overall effectiveness, but by like who benefits and who might be left behind, focusing intensely on vulnerable populations such as displaced children, excluded girls, marginalized rural and indigenous or immigrant communities. So I welcome you all to go through the chapters. The second cross-cutting theme is continuing recovery and meaningful learning. So instead of just focusing on like access and other kind of barriers, throughout the chapters, the authors have discussed and focused heavily on continuing learning, bridging the gaps, maybe due to loss of school days, due to war or other kind of climate disruptions and such. The third cross-cutting theme is professional practice as a lever. So teachers and school leaders are not seen as just implementers of curriculum, but professional practice is thought as a central component in implementing any policy change. So the chapters argue that episodic compliance-based training is inefficient and insufficient. Instead, the focus must be on building capacity through everyday professional practice, such as continuous school-based coaching, mentoring, and leadership routines centered on instructional support rather than mere outcome metrics, such as end-of-course tests. The fourth cost-cutting theme is diagnostic capacity and usable evidence. A recurring finding in this volume is that while educational systems often have plenty of data from different tools, they lack true diagnostic capacity. So the authors propose that moving beyond rigid dashboard accountability, they emphasize that evidence is only useful when it is timely, easily interpreted by practitioners, that means teachers and school leaders, and directly connected to daily routines for improvement, so that they prioritize the teachers are able to bring those diagnostic insights from data into classroom practices. The fifth cross-cutting theme is tech and AI is not seen only as an instrument, but it's a tool whose value is entirely dependent on like how well they align with pedagogy and teacher capacity. So the chapter states that ethical guardrails such as addressing bias, privacy, unequal access, and safety, this must be foundational design requirements rather than afterthoughts of AI policy. And we have quite a few examples. For example, I will discuss a chapter 17, advancing student-centered learning in low-resource Indian classrooms as a key to bring these concepts from the abstract into reality. And this chapter, I think, perfectly illustrates how these cross-cutting themes play out in different domains. So this chapter focuses on equity and meaningful learning. The chapter places equity at the forefront by focusing entirely on low-resource government schools characterized by large multi-grade classes and severe instructional constraints. It confronts the challenges of moving these specific classrooms away from rote memorization toward meaningful competency-based learning and 21st century skills. And regarding AI and tech in education, the authors didn't view educational technology as a standalone solution, but they proposed that, okay, an offline fast approach that utilizes shared device and local servers that teachers can actually utilize to help continue and bridge students' learning gaps. And they also focused on diagnostic capacity and usable evidence. The authors discussed a lot on the limitations of India's high-stakes exam-oriented and accountability systems, which offers little actionable feedback to teachers. So they focused on like, okay, maybe we can propose a 1-minute reading and math probes into daily classroom routines that might give us more diagnostic capacity, and teachers might be able to use those insights in their classroom teaching learning. So apart from that, we also have sequencing as a recurring solution that came throughout the volume. So our authors recognize that the real-world policy design requires judgment and several fiscal, political, and institutional constraints, and others acknowledge that the best theoretical policy is often infeasible. So I love this point, and I was a student of Fernando's in this class in the residential version, and he always focused on this. Maybe the best policy on paper that looks the best on paper might not be the best in reality to implement. So our authors bring that perspective throughout this volume as well. So the phased implementation and sequencing emerge as a recurring solution. So this allows systems to build necessary capacity, political viability, and legitimacy step by step over time. And the last cross-cutting theme, the seventh one, is alignment beyond the education sector. So education policies do not exist in a vacuum, so they must be connected to the broader system. And our authors bring their past, like on average, our students have 17 years of experience in the field. So they bring their practical insights and experiences to this volume as well. And they made the case that, okay, education policies doesn't exist in a vacuum, and they proposed policy solutions that align with the wider systems the education policy work in. So with that, I will hand it out to Eric. I had the privilege of working with Eric as a student and also editing his volume. He worked on the HOPE strategy for retaining teachers in South Carolina. With that, Eric, to you.
Thank you, Shafat, for framing the extension of this conversation that drives this volume. And certainly we salute our esteemed convener, Professor Reimers, and all of our colleagues and peers that have made this volume possible. Shafat, having framed our focus, I'll just begin by lifting a few early observations. South Carolina has been winning the teacher recruitment battle. Starting teacher salaries have risen by 47% since 2018, and vacancies have dropped by 56% over 3 years. The state has successfully turned on the proverbial recruitment faucet. Yet, despite these recruitment wins, our rural and underserved districts are struggling to secure retention wins. For example, Jasper County's annual teacher turnover is 34%. Counties like McCormick and Marion County, 31%. In fact, half of all statewide vacancies concentrate in districts serving just 1/5 of the teaching workforce. And strikingly, early career teachers, those with fewer than 5 years of experience, account for up to 42% of all departures. So the paradox is it's clear. The faucet is indeed turned on, but the bucket is leaking, resulting in an estimated $40 to $50 million annually in turnover costs to the state of South Carolina, with an exaggerated effect in districts that can least afford it. My chapter argues that this leaky bucket is primarily a conditions and leadership problem. Teachers are not only retained by what they are paid, it is very important, but also by whether they belong, whether they grow, whether they feel supported. In partnership with our client, State Superintendent Ellen Weaver's administration, and in alignment with South Carolina's own state motto, Dum Spiro Spiro, the HOPE framework, helping our pupils excel, integrates 3 components. First, professional learning communities, or PLCs, to combat the professional isolation that drives early career exits, building both competence and collegiality in rural districts where isolation is most acute. Secondly, technology-enhanced professional development to reduce administrative burden, deliver just-in-time instructional support, and directly address the bureaucratic overload that burns teachers out before their 5th year. And finally, faith-based and community partnerships to mobilize one of South Carolina's most underutilized assets, its rural faith institutions. These historical institutions, often anchored in communities of color, offer mentorship and the resources needed to root teachers in the communities they serve. Bundled together, the evidence demonstrates that this approach is 2.4 times more effective than any isolated intervention. The projected return on investment is 4.2 to 1 on a $12 to $15 million annual commitment out of a multi-billion-dollar annual budget that serves more than 700,000 students. This chapter resides at the intersection of several themes running throughout this volume. On teacher and leader practice, the framework's core insight is that retention is built in daily conditions and how teachers collaborate, how leaders protect instructional time, and how schools reduce friction. On diagnostic evidence, South Carolina's robust annual working conditions survey data drive the analysis, yielding policy that is grounded in what teachers themselves report, not assumptions. And I do want to take a moment to thank retired Superintendent J.R. Green, who was a part of this session this morning, for his feedback as one of the lead superintendents in the state of South Carolina and the proof of concept for this work in Fairfield County. On implementation, the strategy is phased, monitored, and designed for the inverse capacity problem. The districts with the greatest need often have the weakest implementation infrastructure, which is why state-level coordination is essential. This chapter examines what it takes to move from an analytically sound policy design to one that is operationally and politically executable. The lesson I would offer to any system facing this paradox is this: recruitment and retention require different theories of action. Compensation attracts, conditions retain. And any system that invests heavily in one while neglecting the other will find itself perennially refilling the proverbial leaky bucket. So the question is not whether a state can afford to address conditions. It is whether it can afford not to. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eric. We're going to hear from the last presenter of the morning before we hear from those of you in the audience, and that's Jennifer Teague. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Professor Reimers. And again, echoing the gratitude towards our teaching fellows and editors and to all the colleagues that were involved in the class. What a joy it was to undertake this work, but also what a challenge it was, because many of our personal and professional and academic identities all came together in this project. And I spend a lot of my day thinking about how we expand access to education through online programs. And increasingly, we're talking about how do those programs travel across borders. It's not just an how do we increase enrollments, how do we increase revenue, but how do we make sure that we're doing it in responsible ways that are actually advancing the potential outcomes of the students that we're recruiting. And what I've come to realize, and it might be a bit shocking, is that expanding access, that's the easy part. It's making sure that the education will actually work for the learners in different international contexts. That's much, much harder. So in this case, my chapter 20, looks at the challenge through the case of localizing a US online Bachelor's of Business Administration for the South African market. And my client was a large online US university focused exclusively on international expansion. So the core problem is this: cross-border online degrees can be academically sound, but they can be locally ambiguous. And in this case, the program itself, the online BBA, is strong. It has a rigorous curriculum. It's accredited at the program and institution level. And this institution is a model of what scalable delivery looks like. But for those South African students, employers, and regulators, the key question wasn't just quality, but it was legibility. It was credential signaling. So does the credential map to national qualification frameworks, particularly those in a highly regulated environment like South Africa? do local employers, the ones who will actually be interpreting this degree for future career outcomes, do those employers understand what the credential signals? And most importantly, in my mind, does it translate into real opportunity in the labor market? And the answer, even when unclear, means that high quality programs can often fall short. Why does that matter to any of us here outside of transnational education? It reflects a challenge that we're seeing across global online education in all areas. Access without recognition is not the same as access to opportunity. If a credential isn't clearly understood or valued locally, learners are taking on huge risks, even when the education itself is strong. No matter what they're learning, if they can't interpret it in the local context, it doesn't have meaning for them in their future professional career. So the chapter evaluated 3 primary entry modes for delivering that US online degree in South Africa. Each model had its merits, but they all have significant trade-offs across cost, control, and scalability. So the first option was an academic franchising model where the US institution operates in partnership with a private firm. This offers you the fastest time to market because you're not seeking separate institutional accreditation. It's incredibly efficient, it's scalable, but it lacks regulatory alignment, and it often lacks employer recognition as well. It can have really significant brand and quality risks because the university isn't directly in control of the final product that gets delivered to students. The second option was a fully localized program delivered through a joint or dual degree. This has been considered the gold standard in transnational education. And this is designed specifically for the local context. In this case, the US and the South African institutions manage all their accreditation recognition separately from those South African qualifications authorities. Very, very strong alignment, but incredibly complex, incredibly resource intensive, and really, really slow to scale. So these 2 options had a tension between speed and legitimacy in global expansion. But the third, and ultimately the approach that was recommended, was a co-badged partnership between the US university and a local South African university. It struck the strongest balance between scalability and local relevance, and it allowed both institutions to maintain global quality and to show what they did best while embedding the program within the local systems and qualifications framework. The co-badge model works because it strengthens 3 critical signals. First is legibility. The credential is recognizable within the national system. Second, regulatory alignment. It fits within all the existing South African approval frameworks. And third, employer signaling. It carried local credibility alongside global value. So it doesn't just develop a program, it translates the credential into the local context. And this case connects directly to several of the cross-cutting themes in the volume and that you've heard about here today. It highlights the importance of alignment beyond the education sector, particularly between higher education, labor markets, and credential frameworks. It underscores the role of governance and implementation feasibility. What works in practice, not just in theory, is what we really want to target in this kind of work. It reflects comparative reasoning as adaptation, not borrowing. Things don't translate directly from one context to another. And it shows the importance of sequencing, which is building legitimacy through partnership before scaling. So the key takeaway is this. For institutions expanding globally, the question isn't just, can we deliver this program elsewhere? It's, will this credential actually work for learners in their context? At the end of the day, a degree only creates opportunity if it makes sense where the learner plans to use it. Back to you, Professor Reimers.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was terrific. So I invite all of you who have questions to post those questions on the Q&A, and we're going to turn to them in just a moment. But before I do, I want to invite 2 members of the audience who are with us today. I didn't know they were going to be here, but I'm delighted they do. They're former students. And I'm going to ask them to, they actually did take this course many years ago. I'm going to first invite Teresa Puntual from Brazil to share with us her reflections. Teresa was Secretary of Education of 2 different municipalities in Brazil and has always been very involved in leadership roles in the public education system in Brazil. I forget when you were a student here, Teresa, but I'm thinking it must have been at least 15 years ago. And the other former student is Patricia Vasquez, who was Secretary of Education of the state of Puebla in Mexico, and who's also been very involved in the improvement of public education in Mexico. And so the reason I want to invite them is because this closes the loop of what I'm trying to demonstrate with this activity, which is that now the book and this public communication about the book is a way to sustain the ties that bring together a community, a global community of change makers, in this case, former students, but others of you who are joining. So I'm going to ask Teresa and Patricia to just say a few words based on what you heard. Teresa, over to you. So good to see you here. I'm glad you came.
Thank you so much, Fernando. So good to be here. Can you guys hear me well?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I have good internet connection. I'm at the
We hear
airport.
you well.
Good. Well, it was such a pleasure. I think it's always so amazing how much you're able to produce and how many people you're able to connect with your work at Harvard. And I always want to say IEP, and I have to hold myself because unfortunately that's no longer the name I hear. But yes, it's been almost 20 years very soon that I was at IEP at Harvard, and it's been such it's marked so much my entire career, and especially being able to come back and collaborate with you, Fernando, and other students, current and former, with this work of looking comparatively and looking at policies that can be implemented in different locations. So it was great to hear all these very different contexts and subjects, right? And different types of challenges that we face in education throughout the world. So I'm really glad that I was able to follow. I've already bought my copy. My father's coming to Brazil in May, and he's going to bring it for me. So I'm very excited to read all your chapters and learn even more about all the amazing work you're doing. Thanks, Fernando.
Teresa, thank you so much. For those of you who just heard her talk about the International Education Policy Program, this was a program that I created and led for 25 years that existed at Harvard. It no longer exists in that incarnation. And I just placed on the link a copy of a book that is a study of the careers of many of those graduates. And you'll be happy to know, Teka, that I'm giving a presentation at the Comparative and International Education Society this Saturday on the power of international mobility in education, in which I analyze part of the experience of the IEP as an example of that. Patricia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. As I told you, I have a pretty bad cold, but I'm so happy to be here and so happy to begin this week with learning, as always, from you and your students and the colleagues. First of all, congratulations. I just think that always being part of a book with Dr. Reimers it's a gift, and you'll see how after many years you want to come back and read and reflect about what you've learned with him and also with other members of the class. But I just want to point out something that was just I was just hearing the presentations is that stands out of everything. That even Fernando, you have taught us for many years that learning from others is important, that there's no a right model of implementing things, that context matters. I think that again, this from what I listened is again this worried maybe or this preoccupation or this I don't know how to say, but this sense of how are we going to manage that all kids in the world, doesn't matter if it's Romania, if it's South Africa, if it's Mexico, if it's Brazil, how are they going to have the skills they need for the future? And I think that we still have a long way on that. And I think that book gives us, again, a sense of hope in a world that is just full of wars and battles. And I think that, again, you're bringing us this perspective of we still have a long way to go. And learning from others is and must be the best way to move forward. And there's no just learning from others. I think it's a better way of just trying to implement something new. So I'll stop there, but I really am really happy to be here and really happy to hear from you all. And also, Teresa, I think that I agree on what you said. We need to be a big worldwide team, Fernando, with you.
Patricia, thank you so very much for joining us. So I'm going to turn it over to Shifat, who's going to moderate the questions, and feel free to direct them to anyone here, but I'd like to address one if I can, and then invite others. And it's a question about whether we teach one particular methodology in the course. And the answer is no. The course basically is a mix of, on the one hand, literature on drivers of education reform, policy levers, if you wish, largely focus on the K through 12 education system. So we examine research, for example, on the role of standards and curriculum. We examine research on the role of teacher professional development. We examine research on the role of school leadership and school governance and accountability. And then there is a piece of the course that gives students an array of analytic tools. For example, one of the themes that we begin the class with is a series of readings with former ministers of education reflecting on how they made decisions. And I share a framework that I developed to think about the process of educational change as a multi-perspectival framework, cultural, psychological, institutional. We also, in every class, invite guest speakers who are people who have been, people like Teresa and Patricia, as a way to unpack how it is that decision makers think. We also review a range of models. The concept of a logic theory, for example, is one that we studied. We use an approach to policy analyses that basically consists of translating a problem into a researchable problem from which we examine root causes, identify alternatives, criteria, and then make a decision. We review methodologies like the sector assessment analyses, the policy evaluation. So it's a mix of what I would say substantive knowledge and research, methodological tools, and then students are invited to bring all those things together. And in the context of helping their client, basically, I mean, you will see in the book, come up with a reasoned way to solve a problem. So Shifat, over to you.
Thank you, Fernando. So the first question came in, how is systems thinking taught and evaluated in an authentic learning environment? So I will invite all of our panelists, our students, whoever wants to take this question. How systems thinking is taught and evaluated in an authentic learning system. Like you have dealt with clients, you have communicated with clients, you have learned to, you have read the piece by ministers, and then, yep, Jennifer, to you.
I think this was the part that I struggled the most with, but benefited the most from in retrospect and thinking about the learning experience, because in a systems thinking approach, it's difficult sometimes, particularly when you have an experience in a field, not to come in with presupposed solutions. And rather than interpreting through your lens, this is the way it needs to be, and I expect that confirmation bias to line the data up to this really logical conclusion, having to step back, put your own biases aside, and really listen directly to the client and how they define success, how they define progress. And I think that experience is what is so brilliant about this teaching method, particularly at the beginning of a policy-oriented program, because you're having to recognize that you actually are part of the system, and you have to be cognizant of limiting your own influence as you engage with the client. So very difficult to do in the moment, but very much appreciate the opportunity to flex those muscles.
Thank you, Jennifer. Others? Eric, do you want to take?
Yes, thank you, Shafat. I think the kind of the overarching lesson for me was just engaging in these environments with a sense of humility. It kind of dovetails on what Jennifer shared. There are assumptions that you can make that can be extremely dangerous. I mentioned Dr. J.R. Green, who's on as well. And when I met with him, one of the things that I quickly realized was some of the assumptions that were being made were dangerous assumptions. And he was gracious enough to give me extended context so that I could have a better sensibility to putting together potential methods, levers, etc., to address the issues that were before us.
Thank you, Elena.
Yes, in our case, exactly how Professor Reimers said, we were riding the bike, so system thinking was, in a way, taught through applied work rather than through theory. we had to realize a real policy problem, and we had to be able to connect the causes and to translate and design the solutions to our own context, to Romania, and to the context that we were working on.
Great. With that, I will hand it to Fernando for closing remarks.
Well, we're at time, 12 o'clock. I want to thank all of you for your participation today in sharing this wonderful work done by our students, now former students. I invite all of those of you listening in to read this book. I think you will find the knowledge really, and especially the compilation of all these different ideas very stimulating. That is one of the principles of this class, that creativity can be activated when we look beyond our immediate circumstances, beyond our immediate neck of the woods, when we look at the entirety of the world. I also want to say that in a world that is ever more complicated and challenging, I find it so inspiring and hopeful to basically look at the good work of our students as they actually use their energy and talent to make the world better. So thank you all of you for participating, and thank you very much to those of you who are able to join us today. Have a wonderful day, everybody.